but I'm not nearly as bad as I once was. In the mid-1980s, my ex-husband and I moved to Atlanta, Georgia to attend seminary. And during our first semester there, Mom came out to visit, and since it was her first trip to Georgia, she wanted to do a little sightseeing. So we planned an overnight trip to Savannah, which is about a 3.5-hour drive from Atlanta. When we left for Savannah that Friday after class, my ex-husband, Dean, was still at work in the media lab at the seminary. Now, this is a day before cell phones, remember? Before we had that electronic tether that could keep up with everybody and where they were. Well, Dean had told me before I left that he would be going straight home after class. So the plan was that when we got to Savannah and found a place to stay, that I would call him and let him know where we were staying and give him that number in case anything happened. And that's what I was going to do. But notice I said I was going to call him and tell him where we were staying. You see, I called when we got there and checked into the hotel, but Dean didn't answer the phone. He had one of these stupid green sprout telephones that came with him in the marriage. It wasn't mine. And it didn't ring very loud. And he was a heavy sleeper. Apparently he came home from school that day and from work, and he fell asleep into a deep sleep. So about the time we got to Savannah and I started calling, he was out. And the phone wasn't loud enough to wake him. And of course, being a world-class warrior, I learned this from my mom. Being a world-class warrior, I began to worry. And so, we were supposed to go out and see Savannah and go out to eat and all, but instead, I was calling and calling and calling and calling and calling and calling, and no answer. And the more I called and the more time that passed, the more worried that I got. We did eventually drive around and see a little bit of Savannah before going back to the hotel, packing our bags, and heading back to Atlanta. True story. And stopping every 30 minutes on the way back to call yet again from a payphone, because again, no cell phones, call from a payphone trying to see what had happened. You see, my mind just automatically went to worst case scenario. Dean had epilepsy, and even though in the 11 years that I was with him, he had one seizure, I was convinced that he had had a seizure on that mile-long drive back to our campus apartment and had a wreck. It was somehow in a hospital emergency room or worse, and no one was able to get a hold of me because they didn't know where I was. Yeah, I'm that person. Anyway, we ended up, by the time we got back to Macon, which is, I think, about less than an hour from Atlanta, and I stopped to call yet again, he finally woke up, heard the phone, and answered. But by then, our trip to Savannah was ruined. And we just went ahead and went on back home. You see, I'd let my overactive imagination and my propensity to worry about what might happen ruin our whole trip. I allowed it to steal our joy, because isn't really that what worrying does? It robs us of joy. My over-the-top worrying affected not only me, but it also prevented Mom from experiencing the beauty and the joy of Savannah, Georgia. Last Sunday we talked about Mary, the young girl from Nazareth who was chosen by God to bear the Christ child, and how scary, how impossible it all must have seemed when the angel appeared to announce the good news that was to be. Yet Mary, in the midst of all that was happening, in the midst of what had to have been the most terrifying moment of her young life, somehow managed to set aside her fear and embrace what God was doing, how God was working in her life. And it was this acceptance on Mary's part that enabled her to experience God's peace in the midst of very troubling circumstances. This morning we turn our attention to another character in the Christmas story, one whose importance is sometimes overlooked, and that's Joseph, the man engaged to Mary, the one who would become the earthly father, if you will, of Jesus, the Son of God. Now, that's not an insignificant role, to be sure. So as overwhelmed by the angel's announcement as Mary may have been, And as critical as her response was to how the story would unfold, so too with Joseph. Think about how he must have felt when he learned that his young bride-to-be was with child, a child he knew was not biologically his. I mean, folks, this is a game-changing news. This is the kind of stuff that ruins lives. And Joseph had every right to abandon Mary in order to preserve his own dignity. You see, engagement in the first century world was not the way we think of engagement today. It's not this romantic declaration of intent that we understand it to be. Rather, engagement in the first century world was a legally binding contract that the two persons and the two families had already entered into. So to be engaged, or as some translations say, betrothed or pledged, or whatever word that's translated into English, essentially meant that two people were already married in a legal sense, even though they were not yet living together and they had not yet consummated the marriage. So Mary and Joseph were married in the legal sense of the word, but since they had not yet been together, Joseph knew this child could not be his. And so I would imagine that the first thing Joseph thought when he learned that Mary was with child, prior to the angel coming, was that she had been somehow unfaithful to him. And you can only imagine how that made him feel. I suppose he was as devastated as you or I would be if we found out that our partner had been unfaithful to us. He felt the same kind of pain. I'm sure there was the same sense of betrayal that any of us would feel. And I suspect he was probably more than a bit angry. Given that, given what must have seemed an unquestionable reality of Mary's infidelity, I think there are basically two ways that Joseph could have chosen to respond to the situation. Two options, if you will. Number one, he could have made a public spectacle of Mary's presumed betrayal of him, in which case Mary could have either been stoned or at the very least humiliated in such a way that her life and the life of her family would have been forever ruined. The second option to Joseph was that he could have divorced her. The translation we read this morning says he could have called off the engagement quietly and saved her that very public part of the humiliation, but it would still been humiliating none the same. Now, Scripture tells us that he had already chosen to do the latter because he was a righteous man. In other words, he was a good man. And even though he may have been hurt beyond hurt and angry, he didn't want retribution for what he had assumed Mary had done. He didn't want to get back at her for this assumed, presumed betrayal. And so he decides to just quietly dismiss her, to break the contract they'd entered into, and to go their separate ways. At least that's what he had planned before the angel shows up. Now remember, in Scripture, anytime an angel appears, you can be sure that the stakes are high as to what's coming next. That something big is about to happen. And that was certainly true in this story when the angel messenger appears to Joseph in a dream. Because everything changes. And now, instead of quietly dismissing Mary, Joseph does as the angel commands, and he goes through with their marriage. And he decides to participate fully in this remarkable thing that God is doing in and through her, and through the son that would be born. Now, I don't know, but that just couldn't have been an easy thing for Joseph to do. I mean, even though he was committed to going through it, he knew that people were going to talk. People were going to know that either one of two things had happened, that Mary had been unfaithful to him, or that he and Mary had broken the law, the rules, and had been together before their marriage was complete. So one way or the other, Joseph had to figure, people were going to figure out once the news of Mary's pregnancy broke and how far along she was, the people were going to talk. And so either way, his reputation was probably going to be in tatters. But still, he chooses in this story to believe what the angel tells him. And he goes through with the marriage as commanded. But even so, there's so much, I'm sure, that worried Joseph. There had to be a lot of fear about what he was getting himself into. And that worry and that fear that it's derived from could have robbed him of joy and also of the ability to create joy through this event in the lives of others. In our last Coffee Chords and Conversations, Jeff Ivan summed up rather nicely the futility of worrying. Put it better than I've ever heard it put, and it's one of those things I've asked him about and kind of committed to memory because I think it's my new favorite saying. And since we're in church, I'm going to give you the G-rated version. For those of you who were there, you know why. Jeff said that he learned from a friend a long time ago as a saying. He said, I've lived through more poop that never happened. I've lived through more blank that never happened. Get it? That certainly sums up much of my life. I mean, it's perfect, right? I mean, we borrow trouble when we worry because worry doesn't change anything. It's an illusion that we somehow can prevent tomorrow's heartache, that we can somehow change what's going to happen when we know we can't. So worry is wasted energy. We live through that stuff that never happens, even though it never happens. And what's the point of that, right? That's why I say I'm better than I used to be. I've actually learned from lessons like that one in that trip to Savannah, the futility of worrying. Worry prevents us also from being fully present in the moment. Because when we're worrying about this unknown future event, we're not present to the people around us. And we can't be there to support them. So if Joseph had spent all of his time worrying about what people were going to think, or how he was going to take care of this son of God, how he was going to raise this child, if he spent all this time worrying about all that stuff that was going to be, or might be, then he wouldn't have been able to be fully present to Mary in that moment. He wouldn't have been able to offer the kind of support and encouragement that this young 13-year-old girl surely needed as she tried to comprehend the fact that she was the bearer of God's child. So worry, it robs us of joy. It robs us of being present in the moment. There's really no good that comes of worry, is there? In the story I told you earlier, my over-the-top worrying about what could have happened, even though it was a very slim possibility, affected not only me, but it also prevented my mom from having a good trip as well. And so, yeah, again, I started thinking about this and the what-ifs of Joseph. You know, we don't know a lot about Joseph from the biblical record. There's very few mentions of him. Now, we know that he was supposedly he was still alive at 12 when Jesus went to the temple, because the story mentions his family there, his mother and his father. But we don't know how long Joseph was with the family. It doesn't appear, at least there's nothing in Scripture that says that Joseph was still around when Jesus entered his public ministry at the age of 30. So at some point, his life was probably cut short. So we don't know a lot about him, but we know that when he was there, he had a role in helping shape the identity of this Son of God, this Jesus. So if he had let himself give in to all of the worry about what might have been or what could happen or what other people might think, he would have missed the joy of being a participant in this incredible act of salvation that God was bringing to the world through this baby that was born in Bethlehem some 2,000 plus years ago. Joy. He would have missed the joy. And he would have not been able to help create the joy that birth and that life would bring for people decades, millenniums later. And so I was thinking, what about you? What about me? Where in our lives do we need to hear the angels say to us, don't be afraid. Don't worry. Don't worry. I've got this. Besides, worrying is not going to change the future at all. That's something I need to hear on a regular basis. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Live in the moment. Live in the present. Don't let the worry about what might happen rob you of the joy of being right now. Where do you need to hear that? And to whom do you need to be the messenger of joy, of living in the present, of not worrying for someone else? Who do you need to share that same word to on God's behalf? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Live in the moment. I am with you. Emmanuel, God with us then and now. Thanks be to God. Amen.